All right. Can you hear me? I'm on. I'm on? I'm on now. I hear it now. 5, 4, 3. So I'm going to start my timer so I know where I am. Okay. If at first you don't succeed, try again. That's the historical version of that, right? That's not my dad's version. My dad's version is, if at first you don't succeed, read the directions. That's my dad's version. And unfortunately, way too many times in life, as Daryl and I were just discussing, I needed to read the directions first, and it didn't work out. That gets expensive, as you just said. We're in James. And I have on this slide the mechanics of being a Christian, and I struggled with what this really is. This is the second time around teaching this. I taught it in the foyer back in the spring, and it's likely to be different. So if you're in there, that's good news. If you weren't, it'll just seem new. There are a lot of things in James that look like the direction manual. And I don't have an advancer for those of you in the booth. If somebody's got one, they could bring me, or I could come get one. That's number one problem. There are very practical considerations that James talks about. Thank you very much. Very practical considerations that James talks about. And so this kind of turns into a mechanical discussion over time. I want to tell you, and I feel compelled to tell you, and it's really weird, and I don't know what it means, but it happened, and so I want to share it with you. The night before I started this back in March in the other classroom, I had this dream. And sometimes my dreams are like really vivid. And I don't know if they ever really mean anything, but take this for what it is, and if you figure out it means something, let me know. I dreamt that I was in a classroom, and in front of me there was a set of bleachers, and to my left there was a set of bleachers, and the bleachers to the left were full. And the bleachers in front of me were just 3 like aluminum seats, right? And on the top row, in the middle of the 3 guys sitting there, was Howie Long. How many of you know who Howie Long is? Okay, so middle is Howie Long, flat top, stump of his cigar in the corner of his mouth, menacing me, looking at me. To his left, I'm not sure who it was, another big burly guy. Don't recognize him. To his right, Jason Momoa. Everybody know who Jason Momoa is? Aquaman, right? To his right, Jason Momoa. And I started the class, and I said, you're going to hear things in this class that you've heard your entire life that you never knew came from the book of James. At which point, Howie Long turns to Jason Momoa and says, do you believe that? I mean, loud enough for everybody in the class to hear it. And Jason Momoa says, no, I don't, reaches behind him and pulls out a .22 rifle and points it at me and fires a shot. And that's when I woke up. I can't tell you what it means, but I know that when I started the class back in March, I had a certain anxiety level. So I hope you checked your weapons at the door. And I'm looking in the room, I don't see anybody who looks like Jason Momoa, so I think we're okay. Some of you may look a little bit like Howie Long, but there's no Jason Momoa in here. So, with that context, let's talk about James. Turn there. We're going to get into text in a little bit, but I want to give you some just kind of general outline as we get started. If I can, there we go. Is that readable? Yeah. Okay. I've been chastised for my font being too small, so I've upped the font, try to make the thing a little more readable. So let's talk author first. There are several Jameses. In fact, some of the commentary you read will give you as many as 7 Jameses that appear in Scripture. And it's interesting, that's Endicott's that gives you 7, I think it is, and then immediately starts talking about how 2 and 4 are the same person, and 3 and 8, I mean, there are 3 that I can find that are referred to as James. The first being James, the son of Zebedee. So James and John, Boanerges, the sons of thunder. He would be a possible author. There's James the Less, James the son of Alphaeus, James the Lesser, the little James, James the Younger, are the ways he gets referred to. And Tanya and I have just finished watching the 4th season of The Chosen, and little James kind of is asserted as a character in the 4th season. And that's a possible author. And then there's James, the brother of Jesus. And also known as James the Just later in life. And also one of the potential Jameses. And so you kind of go through a process of elimination to get to who we think, scholars think, is the actual author here. And that elimination, first in the case of James the Less, or the son of Alphaeus, after the resurrection, we don't ever hear of him again. And he just, as one author put it, he disappears into antiquity. So probably not him. Probably not a sufficient historical, weighty character to have penned this and to have had it carry into canon the way that it has. James, John's brother, the son of Zebedee, didn't live long enough to be the author. He's martyred in about 44 A.D. And Acts, I think it's 12:2 tells us that, or maybe it's 2:12. Acts tells us, gives us the events that occur that James, the brother of John, was put to death by the sword. And we get that in Acts, and it would have happened in the earliest of the persecution, and probably before this was written. So where we wind up is we wind up with James, the brother of Jesus. And he's an interesting character to be the author. If you go back to John chapter 7, and you look at the family leaving, the event is the family's leaving for the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus has begun to work signs. Jesus is becoming notorious, famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, or upon their point of view. And his brothers are identified as James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And those brothers are making fun of him in John chapter 7. They're saying to him, if you really want to be famous, why aren't you going to the feast? Nobody does the things you're doing to have notoriety and hides themselves away. Why aren't you going? And it is this, it's mocking, the attitude they take toward him, toward Jesus. And James is specifically mentioned as participating in this mocking behavior. And so we get in John chapter 7 an indicator that the brother is not a believer. In Mark chapter 3, down in the 20s, we get a story about Jesus' family responding to him in such a way that they think maybe he needs an emergency order of detention, that he's insane. They're looking to take him way to perhaps end the embarrassment that was to the family, or whatever that motivation is. He's crazy. In fact, the Greek word there is existemi. He is, literally it translates abiding beside himself. He is out of his mind. And those brothers are specifically mentioned there. However, once we get to the resurrection, James is prominently, well, I won't know it's prominently mentioned. James is mentioned in that passage in 1 Corinthians where there's a list of witnesses. And James is the next to the last one mentioned in that list of witnesses. But he's right there behind, he appeared to 500 at one time. And then he appeared to James. Then he appeared to the 12. And so what you're getting is Paul relating to the church at Corinth. James was there and now appears to be a believer. And of course, what we know happened subsequent to the resurrection is James becomes a pillar in the church at Jerusalem. Becomes one of the first elders there. And by the time we get to the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, James is a critical piece of the dialogue and the debate and the response that happens out of the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And so he's the one with the weight to get the writing into the canon. He's the one that you really can't eliminate by the process of elimination. And he is accepted by biblical scholars as being the author of this letter. It's interesting to me that he is an initial skeptic and a late convert, if you will. We don't have an indication that he's a believer before he sees Jesus after the resurrection. So what did it take to break through to him? It took the resurrection to break through to him. And he becomes not only a believer, but a leader among believers. He becomes a person of weight. He becomes a person of significance in the Jerusalem church. He becomes someone who would have the credibility now to pen this letter. Now, the other interesting thing about it is this is some of the oldest writing in the New Testament. And we can kind of surmise that because the Jerusalem Council is not mentioned in the letter. Now, it's a little bit of a bootstrap, but you think about the significance of that event. So if you go over to Acts chapter 15, what you find is there's this debate going on between the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians, the Gentiles. There's this debate going on about what do we have to do to actually get into the church. And you've got Judaizers who say you've got to go through the law. You effectively have to become a proselyte and then become converted to Christianity to truly get into the church. You essentially have to follow the law to get into the church. And there's some pieces of that proselytization process that people aren't going to want to do. And so that's an impediment to folks entering into the church. And so what you get is a group of men meet at the church in Jerusalem and they say, what are we going to do about this? And you remember there's a letter produced out of the council. And that letter essentially sets forth a short list of things that you have to do. And it's fundamental obedience with a little bit of don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't eat blood, don't be sexually immoral. So you get a kind of a short list out of that letter. But it's an exceedingly important event in the development of the early church that happens somewhere around AD 48. Historically, the scholars place it in that space. So we can put the penning of this letter, assuming the omission of the council sets the date here. We can put this letter somewhere between 44 and 48 AD. Most of the canon is written from 50 on. And so this is some of the earliest writing that gets canonized into the Scripture. Looks like I covered the slide. Okay. That gives you a sense of who we're talking about, and we kind of back our way into it, and when it was written, and we also kind of back our way into that. It is Hebrew in its orientation. The way it is structured, the way the letters put together, I've heard it called the Proverbs of the New Testament. It really has Hebrew wisdom, literature, structure to it. It's delivered in that way. And it's a practical guide. How do we do this thing called Christian? How do we do this thing called the way? What's it look like when we employ ourselves in the work of the kingdom as Christians? It is, because of that, largely focused on what we would call works. What do you do if you're a Christian? And some would say, what do you do to be a Christian? And Paul is clear in his writings, and those of you who have been in the Romans class, you've heard me talk about that a little bit controversial phrase, if you keep it in isolation, that you are saved by faith. You are saved by faith. And Paul says that directly. You're saved by faith. Now, your faith generates something, and that's obedience. And so I didn't say you're saved by faith only, because some people would take that away from that statement. But if you don't have faith, it doesn't matter what you do, nothing's going to work. And so the foundational reality of salvation is faith. And Paul spends a ton of time in Romans trying to make that point. And part of that is targeted at, again, the Judaizers who are saying there's a set of works you got to go through before you can even be baptized. If you don't go through that set of works before your conversion, you're not getting there. And that's what Paul is attacking. Well, James is speaking to Hebrews, and we're going to see that in just a second, the salutation of the letter. But he's speaking to the Jewish community, and he's appealing to what he knows is their foundational way of thinking. I mean, here is a group of people who for hundreds of years, literally, have been tied to a functional outward manifestation, if you will, of their relationship to God. It's been entirely dependent, it's a little unsafe, but in their view, entirely dependent, certainly in their view by the time this is written, entirely dependent on their performance of the jot and tittle of the law. I mean, that's our relationship exists because we follow the law. And we know all the trap that comes from that. And while Paul is really attacking that, James is going to embrace that reality of their mindset and use it to show them faith and to show them Christ. And so it can appear at the surface that this is an attack on Paul, except that it's written before Romans is written. And so maybe it's Paul attacking James. It's hard to say. The point is, it looks like a conflict, but in depth, it is not. They are consistent with one another, and they support one another. And so don't get trapped in this idea that James is preaching a different gospel than Paul preached. Because remember what Paul said about the Judaizers. Number one, why do you want to return to that set of rules? You're freed from that set of rules. Why do you want to go back? Oh, and by the way, those of you who are preaching that we have to go back, just go ahead and go over the top. I mean, when he speaks directly to circumcision, he says, don't just stop at circumcision, emasculate. You might as well. It all does the same. Nothing. And so you've got both of these men writing in depth about spiritual realities, writing in depth about the ability to be adopted into the family of Christ. You've got both of these men talking about how to get there, and one of them really, James, talking about what it looks like when you're there. And so what we're going to explore as we go through the letter is we're going to look at these outward manifestations of what Paul is talking about in terms of faith. Now, that's almost code talk and almost dangerous. Because what's an outward manifestation of an inward faith? There's a whole body of believers who preach that as faith-only salvation and attack the essentiality of baptism. Okay? That is not what I'm doing. Let me be clear. That James speaks to an outward manifestation of your faith, but not as the source of your salvation. Okay? So don't let me mislead you. We're talking about a doctrinally sound teaching of essentiality of baptism as a step in your salvation that is driven by your faith. Because if you get dunked first and then believe, you got it out of order, it may not be effective. If your response to the gospel is, I need to be baptized, and you go do it, there you go. Now you got it in the right order. So don't let me say something that leads you to believe I'm teaching something different than that, because I'm absolutely not doing that. But James is going to spend a lot of time talking about outward manifestations of your faith. Okay? So that's kind of a warning, disclaimer, or something on the front end. So we know who, we know about when, and we know it's not without a little bit of controversy. And we're just going to explore that all the way through. So let's dive into the text. The structure of the letter is a traditional letter structure for the time that the letter's written. And that is the author identifies themselves and then identifies the target, if you will, of the letter. It is a salutation identifying the writer and a description of the intended audience and a greeting. In this particular instance, literally, greetings. And so very traditional structure in terms of what we see in the canon. First word here that I think is of great import is, and good, those colors work. I was a little concerned. A servant of God. So James identifying himself not as the brother of Jesus, which would carry some weight. It might have given it some credibility. But, there's a lot of people, the upper part of the Sea of Tiberias, who might have known what his opinion was of Jesus. So maybe brother of Jesus at the time of the writing is not the most sound way for him to indicate who he is. Now, one could argue that the fact that he has converted, to the extent that he is converted, he is obviously now a believer, and that would add oomph, if you will, to the letter. But here, he's not looking for oomph. He's looking to identify himself as all of us should identify ourselves in relation to Christ and in relation to God. And that is, we are doulos. Now, this is a word Paul uses a lot. It directly translates bond servant, and to get the kind of the true richness of the word, it is important to understand what that bondservant was. Let's hypothetically say you're in debt to someone, and you're in debt to someone to the point that you cannot afford to pay the debt. And so you simply give yourself to your creditor. I am now yours to do with as you will. I will do whatever it is you tell me to do in the interests of paying the debt, satisfying the obligation that I have. All right? Is that our relationship to God? What's the song say? I got a debt I can't pay. Right? And so I'm going to make myself a servant. Pierce my ear. Take me to the door. You know, once the obligation is satisfied, which we can't get to, but once the obligation is satisfied, there were servants who would say, I want to stay in service. And that was this, take them to the door, pierce their ear, to be a symbol of their being, at that point, a willing servant to the master. So here, you know, we have a debt we owe and cannot pay that has been paid for us in the personage of Christ. And so now we are a bond servant to God. We are indentured, would be the more recent historical description of that. We have given ourselves to the master. And in doing so, we have committed to do whatever it is that the master wants us to do. So we are doulos of God. And it's addressed to diaspora. And that's the actual Greek word here. It's translated in ESV, which is what the quote is from, as to the dispersion, or to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, what this tells us also is at the time of the writing, the persecution had begun. And we can kind of see the initial persecution of the church in Jerusalem around 41. And so 41 to 54 is the first Roman emperor who begins, his name escapes me right now, I should have that in my notes, who kind of begins a persecution of the church. We're not talking about the Neronic persecution, which starts later, and it is much more significant. But the dispersion, the diaspora, has obviously already begun. And he identifies his audience as the 12 tribes. What's that tell us? The entirety of the Jewish nation. I'm addressing this letter to the entirety of the Jewish nation who is being dispersed across the known world because of the persecution. Interestingly, not to Jewish Christians necessarily, but to Jews. So there is an evangelical base to the message here. He's writing to those who may be in the way, or he may be writing to those who are not, that he's trying to convince to be in the way at this point. Greetings. And the Greek word here translates directly be well. It's rooted in joy. We're going to look at the word joy here in a few minutes, but it's rooted in that word. So greetings is a good way to translate it, but how you doing? Be well. Now, 2 through 12 becomes kind of the first meaty piece of the letter. And I kind of titled this thing for my own structural sense of how to work through the language. This is process. 2 through 12 is kind of process. So count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and steadfastness have its full effect. You have been made perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. That's almost the Rob translation. Some translations here will call steadfastness, perseverance, and I really kind of like that translation better, but I'm trying to be consistent and use the ESV, which is what we generally use. Here is the first, perhaps confusing part of the letter. Here, the word trial translates perasmos, and it's a putting to proof. And this is something we recognize immediately. This is a trial being an event or an experience that puts your faith to the test. Okay? Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. What? When I think of joy, what is a joyous occasion? It ain't no trial, unless of course you're a trial lawyer. Then maybe. When we think trial, we think difficulty. We think challenge, mountain to climb, river to ford. We think of trial as something difficult, and it is. So how is it we're supposed to be joyous? You know, I used to, when I first started teaching Bible class before I had children, used to talk about how I must not be strong, because that passage over in Corinthians about not being tested beyond what you can stand, and if you take that whole line of lesson there about it being spiritual weightlifting, because the more you endure, the stronger you get, and so the tests get bigger, so the lift is greater, so you're building more spiritual muscle. That whole series of lessons, I used to think, I'm weak because I hadn't seen trial like that. We had a training this week in the office, and one of the pieces of the training was a young lady who was telling us about ACE scores and the impact of a high ACE score on the rest of life. And that's Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACE, ACE score. And it's a 0 to 10 score, and if you're above 4, it has all kinds of really negative impacts on your life going forward. Health impacts, mental health impacts. And my ACE score is 0. I mean, it may be 1, but that'd be a stretch. My ACE score is 0. So I hadn't seen adverse child experience. I don't know that. Grew up in a family that was principled and committed to God, not members of the church, but believers. A very positive childhood experience. And so I don't know those things. Now, I'm suffering from some of the results according to the statistical data, but that's because I make poor choices diet and exercise-wise. But here is a putting to proof of my faith that didn't start until later. And when I started teaching Bible classes and would say, I must not be very strong because I haven't had those tests, boy, was I stupid. Because apparently I invited them. In the last 12 to 15 years, we've done a lot of heavy spiritual lifting. Some of it this morning. But it's obviously true now that the devil thinks I've got a little bit of strength because he's put more on me than I think I can handle. Right? And here we are. Trials. And I'm supposed to be joyful. Now, what is my response to difficulty? What's your response to difficulty? Woe is me. That doesn't sound joyful. What's our common response? Why me? What's our common response to difficulty? right? I want everything to be peaceful and calm. I want everything to be positive, and I don't want anxiety, no stress. I want everything to just be just put me in a recliner and put a remote in my hand and give me something good to watch. I'm going to be great, right? That's what I want. And when I don't get it, my first reaction is not joy. But think about this for a second, and this is what I think James is trying to tell us right up front. If you don't get those trials, you don't get that strength. And if you don't get that strength, you're a target. And you're an easy target. Satan goes after low-hanging fruit. That's number one. Now, he's going to go after the powerful leadership too, because he knows that gets him a lot of the low-hanging fruit if he can pick one of those off. But the first thing's going to happen to you if you're not getting these trials is you're going to be the low-hanging fruit. Now, I consider it an absolute promise of Scripture when it says you won't get what you can't take. But the thing you've got to learn in that circumstance is you won't get what you can't take because it's not just you, it's you and him. I think either Tanya or her sister made it. It was on the wall behind the toilet in her mother's house for years. Just something you notice, right, guys? And it was a cross stitch of a little dachshund. And it said, Lord, don't send nothing that you and I can't lick. Right? Not going to send you a trial you can't lick. And He's not going to send you a trial you can't lick because He's going to be there to make up the difference between what you can do and what you can't do to lick it. Right? That promise builds perseverance and builds steadfastness. And if you will recognize this is a lifelong experience, He's not going to give you what you can't take, but as you figure out you can take stuff, what you think you can't take is going to get bigger. And so the trials are going to come, and the trials are going to get bigger. And if they don't, once again, if they don't get bigger, you're becoming the low-hanging fruit. And so, if you want to be complete and lacking in nothing, then you have to go through this process. Testing of faith, allowing perseverance to cause you to grow, and becoming mature, complete, or finished, lacking in nothing. This is really a positive feedback loop. It may not feel like it, but it is. Because every time we go around the loop, we get a little stronger. Every time we go around the loop, we become a better tool in the kingdom. Every time we go around the loop, we develop credibility for our brothers and sisters in Christ who may be suffering the same trials we're suffering. Every time we go around the loop, we get a deeper faith and a broader trust in the promises. Because when we see the promises play out, it's no longer faith, is it? It's experience. And what do we call that? We call that wisdom. And when we launch into the rest of chapter 1 next week, we're going to see that wisdom is one of the key tools in making sure that we're approaching trials in the right way. And then when we get to the end of chapter 1, we're going to really get confused. Because we're going to figure out that if you're reading this in the Greek, temptation, which is near the end of chapter 1, and trials, which is the beginning of chapter 1, use the same Greek word. And we're going to look at the difference between a trial that grows perseverance and a temptation that can lure us away to death. And we'll pick up there next week.